Music 292. Extra video. Identifying modes. So modes are types of scales. In this class, we'll occasionally be using what are often termed either the traditional church modes or the diatonic modes, which are diatonic collections. In other words, they conform to a key signature in the same way that major and minor scales conform to a key signature. While these diatonic modes are not used much in classical period music, they are used a lot in particular repertoires that we're going to encounter in this course. And that includes medieval music, it includes Renaissance music, although I will say that this era starts to mode mixture in a way that makes the modes more closely resemble major and minor keys. Essentially, there was a gradual change in the Renaissance era that transformed the modes into major minor. We'll also see it in pop music and other related genres from the 20th and 21st centuries, particularly from 1960 onwards. And lastly, we'll also encounter modes in European folk musics, especially Western European folk music and its derivatives. By derivatives, I'm essentially referring to North American folk music as well, since a lot of that music was brought over to North America during the colonization process. The easiest way in terms of what we're learning in this course is to think of mode as a combination of focal pitch and diatonic collection. If you're watching this video before we get to the unit on focal pitch, another way to think about it according to your tonal vocabulary, is to think of a mode as a combination of tonic and key signature. We're going to talk about 7 diatonic modes in this course, and you probably have encountered these already either in rudiments or in some of your previous study prior to coming to Queen's. The 7 diatonic modes in order are Ionian, which is the same as a major scale, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, which turns out to be the same thing as the natural minor scale, and Locrian, which we actually don't see very often because of the way that the scale is structured. I'll talk about that a little bit later. There's actually several different ways to learn and understand these modes. So I'm going to teach you a few different ways, and I'm going to say you don't need to understand every method, you just need to understand one of the methods for being able to identify and write modes. So use whichever method works for you. Method 1. Tone and semitone patterns. So using this method, we can think about the patterns of tones and semitones that occur in any particular scale. When you learn major scales, for example, you probably learn that major scales are based on the pattern tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. What I've done on this slide here is I've actually just mapped this out for you. I've used a circle to represent this just because we're not talking about any particular octave. So if we're starting at C, we can see that pattern that I just read out. Tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. We can think of our modes as essentially using the same patterns, but starting in a different place around the circle. So say, for example, I was talking about Dorian mode. Dorian would start at our second notch on our circle. If we're using the empty key signature, that would be starting on D. And then rather than going tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone, it starts the pattern from that Dorian location and goes tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone, tone. Each one of the modes would map to a different position around the circle based on how their tone and semitone patterns work out. So for example, Phrygian, we could think of as starting on E and then working its way down around the tone and semitone patterns in the C major key signature. Lydian would start on F and then work its way around, and so forth. So this method might work better for people who really want to reference the C major scale. Or if you're somebody who likes to just memorize patterns, we can also just go and memorize the order of the tones and semitones. We can also map in different scales for that C major scale that I've got written on the inside. So if we use a different key signature, we would write in essentially the major scale that matches that new key signature into those slots where I currently have the notes of C major. Method 2, correspondence to major scale key signatures. So along the lines of what I've just said, another way of thinking about modes is essentially to compare them to the major scales and use scale degree to help you figure out where the various mode placements go. I'm going to start to walk you through this by showing you a C major scale, which you'll now see on screen, and notice that I've written the scale degrees underneath there. Those scale degrees actually match up to the 7 mode numbers that I also have on the left-hand side. So Ionian, for example, is the scale that starts on scale degree 1 in the empty key signature and then goes up. So our list in order we can map according to the scale degrees of C major, which you'll see that I've just done on screen. If I wanted to work out D Dorian, for example, that mode can use the same key signature as C major, but its tonic is not C. Its tonic is now D. And when I say tonic, what we're talking about is the most emphasized note in a particular mode. And so the way that this is commonly described is that Dorian would be like C major, but starting on its second note. I will point out that conceptually in reality, what we're actually saying is that Dorian would be like C major, but its focal pitch is D instead of C. Again, if you're watching this video out of order in the sequence, we can think of its tonic being D rather than C. So it's essentially a remapping of what we're thinking of as our tonic note. And so along these lines, we could think of Phrygian as the mode that starts on scale degree 3 of the major key signature. Lydian would be the mode that starts on scale degree 4 of the major key signature, and so forth. And when I say starts on, I'm really referring to that as focal pitch. Because in real music, we're not necessarily just going to have scales in order. We can mix up the ordering of notes when we're creating melodies. Okay, let's do another one to follow through on this concept. So we can actually do this with any key signature. So say, for example, I wanted to do it with the 2-flat key signature. We know if this was a major scale that this would be B-flat major. But again, I could map out any of the other modes based on the correspondence to scale degree. Dorian, once again, would use this key signature but have its tonic as what looks like scale degree 2 in the major scale. So in other words, if we're writing this as an ascending scale, it would start on C and it would end on C, but it would use the 2-flat key signature. We would call this C Dorian. So just a quick aside here, mode names are going to have the focal pitch or tonic note and then the name of the mode. It's not going to match what the key signature is. We can also do this process backwards. So if I gave you that bottom mode, for example, and I asked you to identify it, you could figure out, okay, well, 2 flats is my B-flat major key signature. This is starting on what looks like the second degree of that. So I can go to my little comparison chart and I can say, okay, well, that's Dorian, because I know Dorian starts on what looks like scale degree 2 in major. Method 3, altering notes in a major or minor scale. From a performance standpoint, a ton of performers actually think about modes as essentially being variants of major or minor scales. So we take a major scale and we change one note, or we take a minor scale and we change one note. It's easiest for performers to think about this because performers are much more well-versed typically in major and minor scales. So they think of this really as just a slight change that they're having to adjust as they're going through and they're performing. There's essentially 2 groups of scales that we can refer to when using this method. So there's 3 modes that actually are similar to major scales. Ionian, which we talked about, is identical to major, but Lydian and Mixolydian are almost like major, but they change one note each. In Lydian, we take what would be the 4th scale degree and we raise that a semitone. So in the example I've got on screen, rather than being F natural, it's F sharp. In Mixolydian, we take what would be the 7th scale degree and we lower that a semitone. So with the example that I've got on screen, rather than being B natural, this would be B flat. So we would make that raise or lower adjustment depending what scale that we were starting with. So say, for example, once again, we were starting with a B flat key signature. I still raise scale degree 4 a semitone to create Lydian, but I do it relative now to that new key, relative to B flat major. We'll walk through this in the live class at some point, just so you can get a little more practice with this. There's 3 modes that are more similar to minor. And then Locrian, which is kind of in a weird category all by itself, which we'll come to in just a sec. Aeolian is the same thing as natural minor, so it's going to match your minor key signature. Phrygian and Dorian, though, are once again going to adjust one note compared to the natural minor scale. Dorian is going to take the 6th note of what would normally be a minor scale and raise that a semitone. Whereas Phrygian is going to take the 2nd note compared to a minor scale and lower it. Once again, we can do this in any key signature as long as we think of it in terms of scale degree. If I want to create a Phrygian scale, Say, for example, starting on G, I can think of, well, what's my G minor key signature? And then I'm going to take the second note of that scale and I'm going to lower it. So rather than being A, that would be A flat in that scale. So Locrian is the weird one. We can create Locrian by comparing to minor, but there's two things that actually have to get adjusted: the second scale degree and the fifth scale degree. Part of the reason Locrian is very, very rarely used is that it doesn't have a tonal framework unlike the other modes. What I mean by that is in most modes, in modern day usage at least, it's the scale degree 1 and the scale degree 5 that tend to be the central notes of the mode. They're the focal pitches, they're the things that get the most emphasis. And that's our tonic-dominant relationship that we've talked about a lot in this class. In all the other modes, the scale degree 1 to scale degree 5 interval is a perfect fifth. Like we can see on this slide, for example, A to E in the Dorian mode, that's a perfect fifth. But in Locrian, the scale degree 1 to scale degree 5 relationship actually forms a tritone. And so because of this, this mode is rarely used. It's a mode that doesn't have a tonal underpinning to it. It will sound kind of dissonant. You get some modern composers who use it just for the sake of using it, but in terms of some of the more historical repertoires, you don't really see it in usage. But if I ask you to create it, again, you're going to take scale degree 2, scale degree 5, and you're going to lower each of those a semitone. So that's your basic outline of the 3 methods for creating modes. My suggestion for this, some of you will know this already, in which case, like, you just go do your thing and I'm perfectly happy. For those who modes are new to, if you want to get some extra practice, we'll do a little bit of it in the live class. You're also very, very welcome to stop in for a virtual office hour where I can just throw a bunch of examples for you and have you work it through it on the spot, just to get a little bit more familiarity with them. Thanks for this review of modes. I'll see you in the next video.